In this session, we would be focusing on introduction, and in this session, we will be focusing on the topics of introduction to financial management. And as a part of this chapter, we will try and understand what the subject of financial management is all about. And then we will be focusing on what is the scope, what are the areas that a finance manager needs to focus on, and why are we trying to learn the subject, which are the focus areas for us by learning the subject. So on that note, let's just talk about the Ministry of Finance. We know that in India, Nirmala Sitharam at present is the finance minister, and then she holds a very important portfolio. She is responsible for driving the economy of the country. And from time to time, especially in this difficult time of COVID, we would see that the government would be making a number of announcements, a number of stimulus packages, a number of beneficial schemes in order to facilitate the various segments and the various sectors of the economy. So what exactly is the Ministry of Finance responsible for? They're responsible for managing the fiscal policy of the country. When we talk about the economy of a country, there are two important policies that are crucial. One is the monetary policy, the second is the fiscal policy. Now, what is monetary policy? Monetary policy talks about the prime rate, the interest rates, the lending rates, the deposits rates, etc. So the monetary policy of the country gets framed by the Central Bank of India, the central bank of a country. In the case of India, it is the RBI, Reserve Bank of India. The fiscal policy talks about the government's policy in terms of expenditures and then its revenues. So the government will outline what are the key investment areas, which are the key segments, which are the key sectors that they're planning to pump out the money into. And to pump out that money, what are the sources, what are the sources of money that the government has identified. So when you talk about the expenditures of a company, of the country, of the government at large, the government will have to spend money for defense, the government will have to spend money for infrastructure, the government will have to spend money for transport, healthcare, agriculture, etc. So the domains of the areas, the verticals into which the government will have to spend the money, it is huge, it is immense. And to facilitate those spendings, the government needs income. The form of income that the government would be raising to meet these expenditures would be coming in the form of tax. Now, when we talk about primary, we're talking about the primary sources of income. So the government would have direct tax, indirect tax, then they would also have investments. They would have invested money to public sector companies. There would be revenues which are generated from these companies, dividends which would be rising from these companies, etc. So these are the primary sources of income. And you all must be quite familiar with the terminology which is called as fiscal deficit. What is fiscal deficit? The difference between the government's expenditure and the government's income is what is called as fiscal deficit. So every country, sometimes what happens is they may not be able to match um, their incomes with the expenditures. So if you closely observe the Union Budget of India, which is the India's fiscal policy, there was always a mismatch between the expenditures and the incomes. So the government is trying to match out the difference. So the government would try and meet this difference either through borrowings from other countries or other global institutions such as the Asian Development Bank or World Bank or IMF, etc. So these are the kind of areas that the government could tap into. But what we are discussing over here is that what is meant by fiscal policy. So fiscal policy outlines the expenditures and the revenues of the country, and this is presented in the form of union budget by the finance minister of India. When we talk about the Ministry of Finance has got five major departments: departments of expenditure, departments of revenue, Department of Financial Services, Department of Investment and Public Asset Management, and then the Department of Economic Affairs. So these five departments would come close together at the time of budget preparation. They would be providing the key inputs to the Secretary of Finance, and the Secretary of Finance, along with the Minister of Finance, would be sitting and they would be preparing the budget, and the budget would be presented before the Parliament. And if the entire Parliament is okay with what has been outlined, the budget gets tabled. So this is typically the functionality of finance at a government level. Now let's focus on finance at an organization, at a business, and then also at an individual level. What is meant by finance? So management of financial aspects of a business or an organization is what is referred to as finance. In a nutshell, we are talking about management of monetary resources. We are talking about management of money. We are talking about management of expenses. We are talking about management of incomes. We are talking about management of revenues. So this is what is taken up as a part of management of finance. When we talk about finance, there are two important domains: personal finance and public finance. What is meant by personal finance? When we talk about an individual's finance, financial matters. So when I talk about my personal finance, I'm talking in terms of my salary, my expenditures. I would have to be, spending money for my child's education. I would have to be spending money for my stay. I will have to be spending money for my food, clothing, food, etc. So when management of my financial resources is what is called as my personal finance. Then we have public finance. So under public finance, we are talking about public institutions, financial matters. It could be businesses, it could be organizations, it could be the state governments, it could be the central government, etc. So when we talk about finance at large, there are two important verticals, there are two important domains. You have personal finance and then you have public finance. Now, let's talk a little bit more about finance, and we will be focusing more on financial management. Now, what is meant by financial management? Financial management refers to planning, organizing, directing, and controlling the financial activities such as procurement and utilization of funds in an enterprise. Now, if you would notice over here, we are at first talking about four important domains: the four domains of planning, organizing, directing, and then controlling. So what exactly are we dealing with? These four are the verticals of management. You have the vertical of planning, you have the vertical of organizing, you have the vertical of directing, and then you have the vertical of controlling. So these are the four major domains of management. Management deals with planning, management deals with organizing, management deals with directing, and then management deals with controlling. So these are the four major domains of management. But what are we trying to manage over here? We're trying to manage financial activities. Okay? We're trying to manage the financial activities of an organization. We are trying to manage the financial activities of an organization. Now, when you talk about financial activities in organization, it deals with two things. One is procurement of fund, second is utilization of funds. So when we talk about financial management, we're talking of the application of the four verticals of management, and these four verticals of management gets applied into two major aspects. One is procuring fund and the other is utilization of fund. What is meant by procuring of fund? It could be you would be identifying the sources of finance. It could be in the form of revenue. It could be in the form of taking a loan. It could be in the form of issue of debentures. It could be in the form of issue of shares. These are the areas from where you would go about with the procurement of funds. Once you have got the fund, then you will be focusing on utilization of fund. What do you mean by utilization of fund? Utilization of fund, we are dealing with the expenditure of fund. We are spending the money. We're trying to you channelize the money into different domains. You can channelize the money to procure raw material. You could channelize the money to buy new land. You could channelize the money to buy new machinery. Excuse me. So these are the areas where we would be focusing on the utilization of the funds. So whenever we talk about financial management, we are talking about four major verticals of management of planning, organizing, directing, and controlling, such the way that we would get money and then we would spend the money. Okay, so in a nutshell is what is meant by financial management. So financial management deals with, like I said, four important domains of management, four important verticals of management. First is planning. So when we apply planning in financial management, here we are talking about setting realistic and smart financial goals. Okay, so we want to be a profitable company. We want to be a market leader. We want to hit one crore target. We want to hit 1 million target. So these are realistic and smart financial goals which are set. Every business would have a humble beginning. So, and then they would keep scaling up. So, for example, I remember one of Vinny Bansal and Sachin Bansal's interview in the earlier days. They were telling that they want to be the largest e-commerce player in India. So that is a very ambitious goal. We are talking about a time when in 2006, when Vinny Bansal and Sanchit Bansal are starting off their venture by selling books. So at that time, they are aiming for something which is very ambitious. I'm talking about a time frame where people have not even known about Flipkart. So at that time, they're setting a target to be the largest e-commerce company in India. So now that is a goal. That is an objective. That is the end result that they want to achieve. Now, by doing so, they are defining certain financial goals. This year, we should touch a target of 50 lakhs. Next year, we should touch a target of 1 crore. The year after that, we have to touch a target of 10 crores. So you keep scaling up your financial goals in such a way that you want to match that with your organizational goal. So in the planning phase of financial management, you're setting certain goals, you're defining certain objectives. The objectives could be you want to cut out on your losses. The objective could be you want to add more profitability. So these are some of the goals that you can define. Second is organizing. So here we are talking about in terms of finance, and then here we are talking about how can we go about raising the money. Now, to achieve a goal, to set a goal, to achieve our objective, how can we get the money? Okay, what are the sources? Should we go for a loan? Should we go for a loan from a local bank? Should we go for a loan from a national bank? Should we look at international institutions? Or should we go for debenture issue? Should we go for share capital issue? So you are trying, now you have defined the goal. Now to fulfill your goal, you're trying to identify sources of money so that you can fulfill the goal. The third is directing. So what happens over here? Here you're trying to channelize your money. You have got the money, now you're trying to channelize your money. Okay, so you have set an objective. To meet that objective, you're raising the money, and then once you have raised the money, you're utilizing the money. Okay, then controlling. Now what are you trying? You're trying to sustain your position. So it is just not enough for you to have a goal, get the money, and then spend the money. You have to sustain. You have to bring in certain control measures. You have to try and see what stage are you progressively moving towards your goal? Are you deteriorating away from your goal? You have got the money. Are you effectively utilizing the money? So these are certain control measures that you could bring in. Even at a personal level, we could define certain financial goals. I want to be a billionaire, or I want to be a crorepati, or I want to buy a house, I want to buy a car, I want to buy my favorite, electronic gadget. So these are certain goals that you can set. Now, to fulfill the goal, what are the kind of sources of money that you could look at? You could probably take a consumer loan, or you could take a personal loan, or you could borrow the money from someone, or you could save the money. You could, for example, you decide to buy a house. What you could do is you could start, saving up the money right now itself. I want to buy a house in 5 years. I want to buy a house in 20 years. I want to buy a car in next 2 years. So these are certain personal goals that you can define. Similarly, even for organizations, even for businesses, it is mandatory for them to have certain goals. It is mandatory for them to have certain objectives which are defined. So once you have defined those objectives, once those objectives have been accepted, then you have to identify what are the sources of money that you could tap into, and then you could think of utilizing the money. It is just not enough for you to utilize the money. Then you have to look at certain control mechanisms. You have to look at certain control measures. Okay? So these are the ways by which you can go about achieving your goal. And this is primarily where financial management as a subject has to contribute. This is in fact the reason why majority of the companies, they would have an exclusive department which is called as financial management department. So in this part of the session, we will be focusing on the evolution of finance. How did finance as a subject come into existence? Finance as a branch of academia evolved out of economics. Okay? Now, what you have to realize is that economics is the branch of academics which deals with the management of resources. We all are familiar with the fact that Adam Smith, he's renowned for his famous contribution, which is called as Wealth of Nations. And because of his contribution, he's often accredited as the father of modern economics, or he's accredited as the father of economics. So economics was a subject which dealt with management of resources. It dealt with management of land resources, it dealt with the management of human resources, it dealt with the management of financial resources. So we are talking about money, and money was often considered as a resource, and management of this money resource is what you would be referring to as financial management. So you have money, and that money has to be managed, and this management of this money resource is what you would be calling as finance management or financial management. Okay, so bottom line, what you have to remember is economics is what gave way to finance, and then management of financial resources eventually came into existence, whereby which financial management came into existence. So that is about the evolution of finance. Then moving further, when we talk about the traditional approach, when we talk about the evolution of finance from economics, there are four major phases that we deal with. One is the traditional phase, then you have the transitional phase, and then you have the modern phase, and then finally we have the postmodern phase. So there are four major phases, or there are four major paths to the evolution of finance from economics. Now let's deal with each of these phases one by one. We are talking about the traditional phase. So traditional phase existed between 1920s to 1950s. So this was the time where the economy of the world, the global economy on a whole, was witnessing a lot of transitions. Renaissance got over. From a Renaissance, we gave rise to Industrial Revolution. Industries started coming up, which called in for new profiles, which called in for new streams. So you had the domain of management evolving, and then domain of management coming into picture. You have industrial, revolution taking place. Industrial revolution, going through certain phases. You had at first the mass production, then you have the assembly line production. All this coming into picture. So with that, the traditional phase of finance came into existence. So this is something which existed between 1920s to 1950s. Now here, what you have to remember is that finance primarily dealt with identifying suitable sources of money that was needed by the industries, or was needed by the companies. Here, the focus was on capital formation. How exactly can a business or a company identify suitable and economical sources of finance? So, for example, a company may be needing 1 lakh for its expansion, maybe for its growth, and then how can that 1 lakh be raised? So, if you were a finance manager who lived during this phase, during this era, your primary responsibility would have been to focus on the sources of finance. So here you would have dealt solely with identifying how exactly can the business get the money that is needed. So the emphasis over here was on getting the money that the business needs. Now at this phase, what was quite interesting was the fact that it was more of external stakeholders' view that mattered rather than internal stakeholders' views. So, for example, if you were a bank back then, and then if a business were to approach you for a loan, you were in a position where you could dictate the terms to that business. You were in a position, the institutions, the capitalists who existed during this era, they had an upper hand and they could dictate terms to the companies which were approaching them for sources of finance. So what was rather interesting over here was that the outsider's perspective viewpoints mattered more than the internal or inside stakeholder stakeholder. Okay, so this was a place where external stakeholders had a lot of upper hand. Their viewpoints mattered. So if you were the CEO of a company and the kind of options or the kind of views, the kind of perspectives that you had were not often considered because it is the external stakeholders viewpoints which mattered a lot. Okay, so this what has happened in transitional phase. So this at this era, during this traditional era, the focus was of finance was only to identify what are the suitable sources of money that the business needs. For post this, that is between 1940s to 1950s, there was a transition in terms of the job role or the job profile of the involvement of finance. So they just not only focused on sources of finance, what they started doing was they started focusing on internal matters. They started focusing on day-to-day activities of the organization. So we started noticing that at this phase, the management of a company, they started, especially those who were associated with finance, they started getting involved more and more into the day-to-day activities of the business. Okay, so when we talk about like in this manner, what would happen is we had four major areas. Okay, there were four major areas that we had to deal with. Okay, so in the modern phase, there were four major areas that the business would deal with. And the four areas are investing, financing, financing, working capital, and then dividend decisions. I'll be talking about that a little later. Then what we are witnessing at present is what is called as the globalization phase. Okay, what we are looking at today is the globalization phase. So today, companies, organizations, bodies are no longer restricted by geographical boundaries. The entire globe is seen as one single market. So, for example, if you are a company in India and then you identify that another market, another country's market is more suitable, you could tap in money from there. Okay, so today companies, organizations, institutions are no longer restricted by geographical boundaries. They're seeing the entire globe as one single edge. So you may have heard about concepts like FII, foreign institutional investors, FDI, foreign direct investments. So what is the reason behind all this? This is because that today institutions are no longer restricted by the geographical, so I remember when FII was allowed in India, Canadian Pension Department, of the body responsible for managing pensions in Canada, they saw India as a suitable market and they started channelizing their money over here because back then, around that time, I think this was way back in 2007, Canadian economy was growing only by 4%, but Indian economy back then was growing around by 11%. So it made more sense for them to channelize the money from there. They could almost earn 3 times the returns in India, bring the money here, earn the profits, take the profits back. So today, companies are no longer restricted by geographical boundaries. Okay, if you find that one economy is not so favorable, you find that one geography is not so favorable, you could go to another country, another economy, another market, raise money over there, and then come back. Okay, so you must have heard about instruments like ADR, American Deposit Rates, GDR, Global Deposit Rates. So these are some of the reasons why we have these instruments coming into existence. So today, companies are no longer bound by geographical boundaries. So, for example, ICICI Bank, ICICI Group of companies, today ICICI Bank has presence in India, it has presence in Canada, it has presence in UK, it has presence in Bahrain, it has presence in Sri Lanka, it has presence in Russia. So they are no longer restricted to the economy in India. So what the company has done is they are raising the money from here, they're going to other markets, investing the money over there, trying to raise more capital and then flourish. Okay, so today companies are no longer restricted by in the postmodern phase. What happens is companies are no longer restricted by geographical boundaries. They're seeing the entire globe, the entire world as one single large financial market. Now, when we talk about functions of financial management, we learn that in the modern phase, there are four major areas that the finance deals with. So you have financing decision, then you have investing decision, then you have working capital management, then you have dividend decision. So this is what the modern phase deals with. Okay, the modern phase, when I mentioned earlier that it deals with four major areas, these are the four major areas that they would be dealing with. So when we talk about financing decision, we are talking about raising the money. Should we go for a loan? Should we go for a share issue? Should we go for debenture? You're talking about different options. So the finance manager is looking at different options. The finance manager is looking at different options. So I remember when a friend of mine was closely associated with a certain large jeans manufacturer in India, and he was actually the finance manager of the company, and they had an expansion plan, and what they needed, certain crores of money, and then he was responsible to identify what are the suitable sources. So they found out that instead of depending on retained earnings, it would be better, it would be more economical for the company to go for a loan. And then they were trying to identify suitable financial institution to raise that loan. So when you talk about financing decision, you're talking about identifying what are the suitable sources of finance. Then you have investment decision. In investment decision, what happens is you're trying to identify what are the possible options, what are the possible means by which you can spend the money. Should you spend the money on land? Should you spend the money on machinery? Should you spend the money on furniture? What are the possible domains? What are the possible areas that you could be spending the money into? Then you have the working capital management. When you talk about working capital management, here what we're dealing with is that we're talking about day-to-day activities of the firm. Okay? You have to pay wages to your laborers, you may have to buy raw material, you have to carry out some kind of maintenance activity. So these are the kind of things which comes into picture. What happens over here is you're focusing on the day-to-day activities of the firm. Then you have dividend decisions. Now, every company is focusing on earning profit. So how can this profit be paid back? How can this profit be distributed back to the stakeholders? So this is what is meant by dividend decision. Okay? So these are the four major areas that the finance manager would be dealing with: getting the money, spending the money, manage your day-to-day activities, redistribute the profit. So these are the four major functions of financial management. So we spoke about the evolution of finance. We saw that there are four phases: traditional, transitional, modern, postmodern, and then we saw that modern. This is what it deals with. Now, when we talk about postmodern, it is not necessary that you have to be bound by geographical borders. You could raise money in India, carry out your business in America, and then you could expand, in another country. So for example, you have ambitions of getting into the US market. You need not focus on raising the money in US market itself. You could raise the money probably in Europe, take the proceeds, go to America, start, open up your shop. You could do that. Okay, so these are the possible, that in postmodern phase, these functions of management are no longer restricted by geographical boundaries. Now, let's talk about the objectives of finance. Why do we really have finance why are we learning finance as a subject? Why do organizations have finance departments? Why is it that every organization would look at creating certain job profiles, job roles of finance? What is it, what role do they have to play in the organization? When we talk about objectives of finance, there are two important objectives. First is called as profit maximization. Second is called as wealth maximization. So there are two important objectives of finance. First is profit maximization. Second is wealth maximization. Now let's talk a little bit more of profit maximization. When When we talk about profit maximization approach of a company, now these are two objectives. These are two approaches that the business can adopt. Uh, Sometimes what could be is that it could be a combination of both, or it could be a combination of they may have an inclination towards one and less inclination towards the other. Okay? So, but end of the day, what you have to understand is what is your ultimate goal? Okay? So do you want to make profit or do you want to create wealth? So how are these two different? That is what we're planning to discuss right now. Now, when we talk about profit maximization, we're talking about increasing the profit, maximizing the profit. You were earning 1 lakh, let's make 1 lakh 2 lakh. Okay, now that you've reached 2 lakh, let's make 2 lakh 10 lakhs. This is what is meant by profit maximization. You're trying to increase the profit which is earned by the business. Now, profit maximization can be achieved in two ways. You could maximize your output or you could minimize your cost. There are two ways you could achieve this. First is that you could maximize your output, you could minimize your cost. Let's talk about maximizing output. So for example, let's pick up on the company ID Fresh, which was started by PC Mustafa. So initially when PC Mustafa started off with ID Fresh, their focus was exclusively on in Bangalore. Bangalore was back then a cosmopolitan city. They felt that this market is really good. They started focusing on Bangalore. Once they found out that they're doing well in Bangalore, they started focusing on the other metropolitan cities. So now they're present in Mumbai. Now they have an ambition to expand it to tier 2 cities like Bangalore, Hubli, Pune, etc. Okay. So what are they basically trying to do over there? Oh yeah, I just came to know recently that they have ambitions to expand in the Middle East as well. So they started, operating out of Middle East countries as well because they want to expand their operations. Let's talk about a simple bakery which has started in Bangalore. I'm pretty sure almost you must have heard about Amma's Bakery. Okay? The famous baker who started out of Kamanalli, and then they have expanded into different parts of the city, and then from Karnataka they started setting up shops in Kerala. They started doing well, and today now they've expanded to the Middle East. In UAE alone they have around 3 to 4 outlets. So what are they trying to do? They're trying to maximize their output. Why do they want to open up more and more shops? Because they want to increase their sales. By increasing their sales, they want to achieve more and more profit. So one way by which you could maximize your profit is by increasing your output. Okay? You're increasing output. You're producing 1 unit. Let's make 110. 10 becomes 100. 100 will become 1,000, and it goes on like that. So this is what is meant by profit maximization. In profit maximization, what you're trying to achieve is at the end of the day, you want to increase your profit. The second objective that you could follow is that you could minimize your cost. What could do is what you would be identifying opportunities to streamline your activities. Okay? You were spending, let's say 40% of your money you were spending on your fringe benefits. Okay, let's try and streamline that. Or you realize that until now you were focusing on labor intrinsic method of production. Let's switch over to mission intrinsic method of production. So what are you trying to do? You're trying to cut out on your cost. This is called a scale of economies. You're trying to better your productional activities. So there are different strategies that you could adopt for this. So this is what is meant by profit maximization. But end of the day, what you have to remember is sales minus expenses. That is what will give you your profit. So when you're increasing your profit, when you're trying to maximize your output, what you're focusing over here is you're trying to maximize your sales. You're trying to increase this part of your of the equation. Or when you're trying to minimize cost, what will happen is you're trying to focus on this part of your expense. Okay, you're trying to bring this part down. So either you bring this up, okay, when you bring this up, automatically your profit will go up, or you try and bring this down, what will happen is you may come. So maybe I could pick up on some funny examples. I'm pretty sure back there was some point of time in IT companies, food was free, food was on the company, transport was on the company. Then they started bringing in cost-cutting measures. They said, okay, we will give you food one time, we may give you transport one side. So basically, what are all these? These are strategies to minimize costs. They're trying to bring down over here and they're trying to increase the profit. So this is what is meant by profit maximization. The next approach the finance manager could focus on is wealth maximization. Here, you're trying to create benefits for your stakeholders. You're trying to increase the market share. So one classic example is Tata and Sons. Any Tata company that you'll focus on, they would always focus on creating a value addition for the stakeholders. It could be customers, it could be their staff, it could be their management, it could be the society at large. Any stakeholder involved in their entire business, they would focus on creating a value addition for them. I remember working with one of Tata companies. So if you have a Tata company ID card, any one of the subsidiary companies that you carry out an interaction with, if you show your card, you will get 5% discount. So if you walk into a fast track showroom, show your card, you get 5% discount. If you walk into Titan I Plus and then you pick up a brand new specs, you show your ID card, you get a discount. If you walk into Tata Motors outlet, pick up a car, show your ID card, you get some amount of discount. So what is this? They're trying to create a value addition for their stakeholders. Office or their employees is one of the stakeholders. So some of the examples of, Jamshedpur, the township of Jamshedpur, all these are classic examples of how the company focuses on creating wealth. So what is the rationale behind this? When you create a value addition for your stakeholders, it will automatically maximize your market share, whereby it will improve your company's branding, and then that will indirectly create a value addition for your company, and then you will automatically it will maximize the overall wealth of your entire company. Any Tata company that you look at, you would always notice that there is some value addition that they're thinking of creating. So the Tata Nano project or any of those aspects that you think about, they're always focusing on creating a value addition for the stakeholder. So this is what is meant by wealth maximization. So often the finance manager is torn between two parts. One is maximizing profit, second is maximizing wealth. Okay, so this is what is meant by objectives of finance.